We have a fantastic seminar today about envisaging Pacific futures. And before I say a little more about that, I just would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of land and water. Where I am at the moment, that's the Ngunnawal people, but the custodians of land and water elsewhere, wherever you may be. So today we have 5 of the department's newest PhD scholars, and they'll be exploring the possibilities they envisage for our Blue Pacific region. And it's each of them will talk for about 2 minutes on a theme that is linked to their thesis topic. So they will be answering the question, this is what was posed at the outset, the question they set themselves. In your ideal world, what would the Pacific of the future look like? They will take it in turns to give their presentations, and I will be introducing each of them in a very brief fashion. So I would ask you to keep your questions and comments, not to actually ask them directly, but to put them in the chat room or to wait until the panel has finished. And I will assist by reading out some of the questions that may have come up in the chat room. And before I introduce the first of the panelists, I just want to remind you that the session is being recorded. Okay, so let me turn to our first panelist, Leituala, Kuiniselani, Toelupe, Tago. She's from Samoa and has over 23 years of professional experience working in the Pacific region. Her background is in social development policy and practice, where she has held several leadership roles in government and also at a regional level. The topic of her research is deconstructing the relevance of the Boe Declaration and regional security in the COVID-19 era, focusing on lessons from Fiji, Kiribati and Samoa. And her theme is regional security framework based on the Boe Declaration in the COVID eras. So I'll hand over to you, Kuiniselani.
Okay. Whawhetai, Judy, e mo na o whaatulo watu le pa ia wa fia. Whaamalo soifua malangi mama. Whawhetai le alofa le atu o mawhai ono tātou poto I lunga o ala so ta inga whaanei ona po. Ai maise o lea ua taulau o le whaamoe e pei ona ata whaina. Talofa lava, Nisambula Vinaka, kia ora, good afternoon or good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We bring to you warm Pacific greetings from our various locations across the ocean, and we thank you for agreeing to travel with us on our voyage into the future. Our panel today tells the story of how we envision a new future for the Pacific, drawing on our intended individual research to raise some questions and generate a conversation on what the future is for our Pacific region. People of the Blue Pacific continent are storytellers, and we have been using storytelling for centuries to share our his stories and her stories, our knowledge including what is sacred to Pacific people, ensuring that our stories are passed on to generations to come as part of our oral history, and more importantly, that what is told is representative of our voices as it relates to research. In telling our story, we use the metaphor or symbolism of a Pacific waka, va'a or canoe, and what we refer to in Samoan as folaunga or voyaging, to depict our journey into the future. As custodians and stewards of the Moana or the Blue Pacific Ocean, our stories as navigators are evidence of our connection to the ocean and our connections with each other, acknowledging the relationality of our existence and envisioning Pacific futures that sees the paddling together of our waka, our va'a or canoe embedded in our Pacific context, in our cultural identity and our cultural values. In reflecting on our story, we acknowledge the fact that the conversation on a future or the vision for the Pacific is intertwined with how our research agenda should be framed, including the need to genuinely engage with our people, applying an inclusive approach that ensures we are all on board our waka, our va'a, or our waka, and are ready to set sail into the future. In this volatile environment, we therefore explore a diverse research agenda that builds on the strengths of our cultures and contexts, that enables Pacific voice and agency, and contributes to our adaptability to the changing environment into the future. It reminds me of a Samoan proverb which says, "Elu tiai puava ai mapui whangalele," literally translated to mean, distress at puava, but rest at whangalele. This is applied to our current context where, while we are experiencing distress as a result of COVID, we will find rest and refuge at whangalele in our journey ahead towards recovery and towards a Pacific future that we want. My research, as Judy mentioned, is on deconstructing the relevance of the Boer Declaration and regional security in the COVID-19 era, where I will be highlighting lessons from Samoa, Kiribati, and Fiji. Since the declaration by WHO of the global pandemic in March 2020, nations across the Pacific, as you're well aware, have continued to observe border closures, declarations of national states of emergencies and lockdowns to ensure the protection of their citizens and populations from COVID-19. Now, 2 years prior to COVID, Pacific Island Forum leaders endorsed the Boer Declaration on Regional Security, thereby providing the framework for addressing and responding to security issues in the Pacific. An important question for this research is, what is the future of security in the Pacific in this COVID environment? And are there alternative futures for security in the Pacific? Using an indigenous methodology, my research will apply a bottom-up approach to explore security from the lenses of Pacific people themselves, to shape a security regional framework that is not only fit for purpose, but one that is relevant and embedded in Pacific philosophies, ways of knowing, thinking, and being. Recognizing the strengths of our indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, I will delve into Pacific perspectives on security to connect the realities of our people on the ground and our policy responses from a national and regional perspective. This will enable us to navigate a pathway forward that reflects the relationality of our existence, to navigate a future that capitalizes on our values as a collective, towards framing a security policy agenda that is truly informed by our voice and our agency as people of the Blue Pacific continent. This, ladies and gentlemen, is only the beginning of our story and our journey, and I will now hand back to Judy for the next leg of our journey. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely way to introduce the presentations. And I'll now turn to our second speaker, Jope Tarai, whose research interests include Pacific politics, diplomacy, regionalism, and new media landscapes. And the theme that he's focusing on is politics.
Sorry, I thought Athaulla was going next. Or could I be wrong?
No, sorry, I had it down incorrectly perhaps. Anyway, if Athaulla would like to go next, I will introduce him instead. Sorry about that. His topic is international politics and construction of climate security in small island developing states, lessons from Samoa, Vanuatu, Maldives, and the Bahamas. So Athaulla Rasheed is, her research involves studying the formation of climate security knowledge in the Pacific Islands and explaining how Indigenous knowledge in small islands can help better navigate their role in international policy making. He is from the Maldives and his theme is climate change.
Thank you, Judy, for that introduction. Also, thank you, Kuiniselani, for that wonderful presentation and sharing your thoughts. In a similar vein, I will try to share my thoughts concerning my research. The Pacific Islands have taken a firm stand under the stewardship of the Blue Pacific to promote collective security interests, while also extending their leadership on promoting climate security beyond national and regional space. Our vision for Pacific future also includes building greater leadership and ownership in the global fight against climate change. In this respect, Pacific and international research have made a significant contribution towards building this identity for Pacific Islands, including for their other island peers. My research involves exploring the Pacific Islands and their role in international climate security debate. More importantly, it seeks to understand the formation of climate security knowledge in the Pacific Islands. This is to explain how indigenous knowledge in the small islands can help better navigate their role in international policymaking. As SIDS, or the small island developing states, have taken a center stage in the international climate negotiations, the Pacific Islands bring a wealth of knowledge about the unique experiences faced by small and low-lying islands, as well as how such island communities have traditionally built their resilience against climate change. One thing to note here is that Pacific Island communities have close cultural and spiritual connections to their seas, land, and environment. It is important to understand these connections at local levels to explain what has been threatened and the climate-induced activities posing those threats, especially what type of measures are needed to address those threats. The climate change has also been declared as a great threat the greatest threat faced by the Pacific Islands. This comes with the idea that climate change poses an existential threat to small island states through effects of sea level rise and other extreme events. In terms of threats, climate change weakens the local and natural capacities to deal with the changing environmental conditions. For example, without rapid sea level rise, an island is capable to recreate coral and its sand. Local population can adapt their social and economic activities around the coasts, and without abrupt temperature changes, agricultural communities can get enough time to change crops. So on with regular weather changes, communities can adapt. However, the multidimensional nature of climate change, that is when natural things aren't normal, adds further challenges to existing capacities for Pacific governments and communities to address the issue. In this respect, the impact of climate change move beyond sectors and affect different community layers differently at different times. This makes context an important factor in building knowledge on climate action. Here, I think indigenous knowledge and stories are important to understanding the actual capacities and opportunities in the islands before we try to understand the conditions that affects the islands, both to drive adaptation and mitigation action and climate security. I'll stop there for now and maybe expand on those later, and I'll hand it over to Judy. Thank you.
But I hope I have the right speaker next. Philippa Louey. who is exploring the mobilisation of the blue economy in the Pacific Islands with a particular interest on how this agenda is being translated from promise to practice. In 2020, Pip undertook a research internship at the Pacific Network on Globalisation, and she continues to work as an engagement officer for the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, and her theme relates to oceans.
Lovely, thanks Judy. And thanks Leituala and Atho for sharing your insights and for setting such a strong course for this discussion so far. So for this next leg of our journey, I would like to share with you some of my observations of the exciting but also potentially treacherous currents that are gathering momentum in the Pacific Ocean development seascape, and share some early reflections on the impacts that these could have for Pacific futures. Firstly, I want to recognise that as a researcher who hails from outside the region, it is not my place to dictate which direction Pacific peoples and their communities choose to ride these ocean development currents. I'm not the navigator. Instead, I share my observations in the spirit of collaboration and solidarity, seeing my role as researcher similar to that of Lookout, watching the seascape for ocean development patterns, scouring for potential dangers, and pointing out currents of potential opportunity. By sharing these observations with you today, the crew aboard our Waka, I hope to support our collective efforts to navigate towards a self-determined, just, and vibrant Pacific future. From these early few months of research, I have witnessed an enormous upswelling of ocean development currents across both global and Pacific seascapes, which appear to have rapidly risen to the surface over this last decade. These currents are many and varied, some clashing in furious fronts, others getting swept up and absorbed into the waters of much bigger currents, and others still forging their own paths. Today, I ask of you the opportunity to share my observations of two currents that I see growing in the Pacific seascape. Streaming in one direction, I see a current dense with foreign-led ocean activities that are carried along the surface, spurting promises to deliver big money for the Pacific. The activities in this current are constantly bumping into one another and vying for space, but little sea life is seen riding in these waters, as all the nutrition appears to have been drained into the pockets of overseas magnates or consumed by the administrative budgets of distant headquarters. Some of these activities inflate their stomachs with speeches about sustainability and blue futures, but this inflated self does not hold and soon collapses to reveal just another object of development conventionality, or worse, industrial greed. Another current, however, is flowing from behind our Waka and towards the horizon. This current stretches deep and its waters are rich. Age-old practices and knowledges which have served Pacific communities for generations float through these waters, being renewed, re-envisioned as they travelled from past to present and towards our future. Gliding in these currents are activities that are designed by the Pacific, for the Pacific, and in service of the Pacific, with an interest in distributional justice and self-determination. One may see customary marine tenure systems riding in these waters, or Indigenous climate adaptation practices. Look, and you'll be almost sure to see the PNA's Vessel Day scheme. I share these observations today with the hope of supporting the decisions of the crew that I am privileged to journey alongside in this Waka. The ocean development seascape is something that Pacific communities have navigated for centuries, for millennia, and it is an honour to learn from and with my crew as we sail into the future. I'll hand back to Judy. Thank you.
Thank you, Pip. And next is Joe, but I've already said a few words about him, and his theme is politics.
Thank you, Judy. Just get on. Bulunaka, everyone. Thank you very much, Kuiniselani. Thank you, Athaulla. Thank you, Pip. That was really great. My topic is just around digital Oceania. And I just wanted to briefly discuss, and I really like the way Judy opened it up, about the ideal world that you would see the Pacific, or what it would look like. From my standpoint, in an ideal world, the Pacific for the moment would look like, in a COVID environment especially, the Pacific future is definitely a digital one. And this is where I'd like to introduce the idea of digital Oceania, largely because of the way that Kuiniselani had framed for us how we can see and how we can sail through these particular notions and ideas towards the future, or at least the way we have seen the Pacific. Before I detail this idea, I think it appropriate to acknowledge three powerful oceanic juggernauts, or should I say storytellers, whose work and ideas and conversations, for one, a genuine friendship that has empowered and really shaped a lot of the way I see the Pacific. These particular oceanic scholars have definitely planted the seeds for many on how the Pacific is framed and often reframed in various regional notions. But out of these, the notion that is so appealing to me is a notion of assertion and self-determination of the people of Oceania. And these are the works of none other than Epelia Ofa, and we'll never forget the lasting wisdom and friendship of the late Tertiary Tewa, and of course, one of my favorite writings of Bernard Narakobi's Melanesian Way. The ideals of the blue Pacific, blue continent, large ocean states, and definitely in Tertiary's words, and I quote, defiance of the pedagogy of hopelessness, coupled with Narakobi's underlying ideal of collective interconnections, have definitely crystallized in my mind that not only the Pacific future, but the present reality, especially because of COVID, is a digital one, is the idea of digital Oceania. Digital Oceania is equally as much as the Pacific future as it is a present reality, as I've stated, rooted in the Pacific context of fast developing information communication technologies, and of course, as we're seeing, geopolitical contests over undersea cables and control of information. This particular idea proposes, or at least I hope to eventually examine, the scope of what digital Oceania is, its landscape, its implications, some of which are already apparent by government reactions across the region, and ultimately argue that digital Oceania empowers the Pacific Islanders, or Oceanians specifically, and provides a nexus between what the late Haufa often critiqued as the disconnect between ordinary people of the Pacific and those in the state apparatus of decision-making. This will unveil interesting ways, I hope, of examining what often at times has become a repeated way of researching politics, democracy, security, activism, and diplomacy across the region. Of course, it's worth acknowledging that the unifying position and framing of the blue continent, large ocean states, and our canoe is certainly a pertinent one for regional state assertions and interests. Digital Oceania is not only able to accommodate this unity, but also exposes the need for nuances in these challenges within Pacific states. To some extent, it is exposing a lot of the colonial, or it could expose a lot of the colonial constructions of not only regionalism, but state-structured societies, paving the way for its evolution to more a focus on non-state actors or Oceanians in its orientation. Definitely, COVID-19 has made digital technologies all the more valuable and relevant, as very much evident even in this discussion. We're able to zoom in from different parts of the Pacific, or at least in different parts of the wider Pacific. And with COVID-19 creating a new normal, online meetings will continue to be relevant, and therefore digital Oceania continues, or essentially has begun, in its relevance. This also involves Pacific leaders now conducting sessions away from traveling to major locations, but from the comfort of their offices, talking about and of course asserting notions within the blue continent. In the interest of time, I'm open to sharing or discussing in the Q&A notable examples from where I'm basing a lot of this idea, exemplifying the presence and expansion of digital Oceania. These notable instances also reveal the ongoing struggle of connecting relevant context-based research with existing, or for some cases in the Pacific, non-existing policies. But for the moment, let me conclude with one of my favorite quotes from Haufa. Oceania is vast, Oceania is expanding, Oceania is hospitable and generous, Oceania is humanity rising from the depths of brine and regions of fire. Deeper still, Oceania is us. Naka.
Lovely, thank you, Joe. And now we have our final panelist, Jayden Evett, who's from Athaulla, I'm having trouble this morning speaking. Athaulla. Can you say it for me, Jay, when you get to speak? New Zealand, with a background in diplomatic studies. His research looks at how changes in domestic Māori and Pākehā relations have impacted New Zealand's foreign relations with Pacific Island countries. And his theme really is, I gather, envisaging partners and neighbours. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Judy. And tēnā rā koutou to Leituala, Athaulla, Pip, and Jope for taking us on the voyage this far. As the person who's kind of leading the last leg off here, my focus is more on the external actors in the region. So we've explored the currents and forces which propel our waka, which drive Pacific people forward. But what of non-Pacific people and external actors in our blue continent? What is their role and their place in tēnā he kinga ki mua, this voyage to the future? I believe the answer lies in three questions. The first being, who's in the waka, who's out? You can't straddle two waka at one time. It's both not great policy and it's physically uncomfortable. So you've got to choose which side you're sitting in. Are you in the Pacific waka? Are you out of it? Are you a donor or are you a member? Are you kin or are you big brother in the Orwellian sense? There's very few countries that this applies to, but it applies as quite a large thing. Second, if you are in the waka, are we all going to the same place? The old Māori whakatoki or proverb, kaua e rangirui tia te hapai o te hau, te kore te tātou waka i u ki uta. If we are in the waka together, we must paddle at the same time or else we won't reach our destination. It requires those on board to act together. You can't paddle when it suits you and then stop, or worse, drag your paddle when it doesn't. So if you're in the waka, you've got to be committed to it. And then that third question being, if you're sitting outside the waka in your own one, is the Pacific waka free to plot its own course and destination? So some in our region choose to sail alongside in their much larger waka. It's completely fine, nothing wrong with that. The issue then becomes when they use their wakes or their hulls to try and push the Pacific waka in a different direction without any regard for choices made by those who set its course. So the question there really is, are you committed to regional self-determination? So our Pacific future requires decolonized partnerships. Reaching the Pacific of today needed political decolonization. The Pacific of tomorrow needs external actors to decolonize how they think and relate to the region to support its development in a partnership of mana taurite or of equals. My research explores one example of how this might be achieved. I look at how domestic changes in Māori Pākehā relations in Aotearoa, New Zealand, impacts its external relations with Pacific Island countries. Of the countries straddling to waka, and that first question, Aotearoa seems to be the one that's the most torn about which one it will step out of. Its modern relationship with the Pacific still rests on colonial foundations. Because of this, it's essential we understand how shifts in relations at one end of the colonial axle affect relationships at the other. Just like my colleagues before, this work is embedded in the Pacific context. It goes beyond state diplomacies to capture the holisticity of relationships which define the region. The connections of Māori, churches, diasporas, popular culture to the Pacific will all add depth and dimension to what this project comes to find. As no relationship goes one way, Pacific voices and experiences play a huge role as well, engaging the impact and reception of how Aotearoa has chosen to relate to the region. This all links back in the end to our waka's hekenga or voyage to the future by illustrating if and how external partners can change their relationship to the Pacific's journey forward. Though Aotearoa's circumstances are unique, I'm confident that there are practical lessons of what and what not to do to achieve this. Reaching this Pacific future is not a matter of he waka eke noa, of all being in the same canoe. External partners can sail alongside and join the hekenga if they put in the mahi, if they put in the work to work with Pacific peoples in a true partnership of equals.
Thank you, Jay. That was fabulous. And I do apologise for my pronunciation or lack of pronunciation when it comes to Maori words. Okay, that's the end of each of the panel speakers giving their short presentations. I wonder if the panelists would like to say anything now, just a quick comment at all, now that each of you has had a chance to give your short talk?
Perhaps maybe just reiterating some of the core messages that we wanted to kind of highlight as a group, if that's okay.
Sure.
So in terms of envisioning futures, you know, we envision Pacific futures that sees the paddling of our waka or va'a together into that future that embeds Pacific context and values, ensuring a connected approach to our research that captures the multiple dimensions of development and of our identity and existence as a people, and engaging a research agenda that enables Pacific voice and agency and the adaptability of our people to the changing environment towards building a relevant and an inspiring future. Thanks, Judy.
I don't want to say anything more. That's such a lovely positive note to end on. And you will notice in the chat, there's lots of people saying thank you. And all I can do is echo that sentiment. It has been fascinating and really rewarding hearing from you all. So thank you so much.